At 7:17 in the morning on the 30th of June, 1908, a reindeer herder named Semyon walked out of his tent in the middle of the Siberian taiga to check on his animals. It was an ordinary morning, cold air, quiet forest, the smell of pine and wood smoke. Then the sky split open. A blue-white light, brighter than the sun, tore across the horizon, and less than a minute later the ground itself seemed to jump. Semyon was thrown off his feet from more than 40 miles away. Windows shattered in towns hundreds of miles distant. And when explorers finally reached the site nearly 2 decades later, they found something that still doesn't fully make sense. 80 million trees, flattened in a neat radial pattern stretching over 800 square miles, all pointing away from a single center point, like a giant had pressed a stamp into the earth. But there was no crater, no meteorite fragments, no piece of rock anyone could hold in their hand and say, "This is what did it." Just scorched, splintered forest and a silence that swallowed the evidence whole. This was the Tunguska Event, and more than a century later, scientists are still arguing over exactly what caused it. The leading explanation is that a stony asteroid, somewhere between 50 and 60 meters wide, entered the atmosphere at incredible speed and detonated in midair with the force of 10 to 15 megatons of TNT, roughly 1,000 times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima before it ever touched the ground. That would explain the flattened trees, the shockwave that circled the planet twice, the strange bright nights reported across Europe and Asia for days afterward. But it doesn't fully explain why no fragments of the object were ever recovered, why the blast pattern looks the way it does, or why, at the exact epicenter, a small cluster of trees was left standing upright, stripped bare like flagpoles. Every serious investigation since has come back to the same conclusion, probably a cosmic impact. Almost certainly not aliens, not a black hole, not a secret weapons test, despite what 100 years of pulp fiction and conspiracy blogs have insisted. And yet, the case has never been fully closed, because the one piece of hard evidence that would end the debate, an actual chunk of the object, has never been found. Tunguska is the first stop on a tour we're about to take through some of the strangest, most stubbornly unexplained objects, places, and signals ever recorded. Some of them turned out to have simple, almost disappointing explanations once real science got involved. Others are still sitting there today, daring anyone to figure them out. And the pattern that connects all of them is the same pattern that connects Tunguska. Humans finding something that shouldn't exist, refusing to look away from it, and slowly, sometimes over 100 years, chipping away at the mystery piece by piece. Let's go back further, to 1513, to the deck of an Ottoman warship in the eastern Mediterranean. An admiral named Piri Reis, a career sailor who had spent years as a privateer before rising through the ranks of the Ottoman Navy, was compiling a map. Not from his own explorations alone, but stitched together from roughly 20 older charts he had collected. Portuguese sailing maps, Arabic charts, ancient Greek geography, and, according to his own handwritten notes, a fragment of a map that once belonged to Christopher Columbus himself. Piri Reis finished his map and presented it as a gift to the Ottoman Sultan. Then it disappeared from history for 400 years. In 1929, a German scholar going through the dusty library of Istanbul's Topkapi Palace pulled out a piece of gazelle skin parchment, roughly a third of the original map, and realized what he was holding. The surviving fragment showed the coastlines of West Africa and the eastern coast of South America with startling accuracy for its time. But along the bottom edge, there was something else, a landmass curving away to the east that some researchers, decades later, would claim was Antarctica. Not just Antarctica as we know it today, buried under nearly 2 miles of ice, but Antarctica's coastline as it supposedly looked 6,000 years ago, before that ice existed. If true, that would mean whoever originally charted that coastline had mapped an ice-free Antarctica thousands of years before. Recorded history says anyone reached it, and centuries before, Antarctica was officially discovered at all. An American college professor named Charles Hapgood ran with this idea in the 1960s, arguing it proved an advanced, forgotten civilization had once sailed and surveyed the entire globe. It's a genuinely thrilling idea. But when cartographers and geologists actually sat down with the map instead of the theory, the mystery mostly evaporated. Piri Reis himself wrote directly on the map that he built it from Ptolemaic and Portuguese sources, plus Columbus's Caribbean charts. And ancient Greek geographers had long included a mythical landmass called Terra Australis in the southern hemisphere simply because they believed the world needed to be symmetrical, with a big landmass in the south to balance the ones in the north. The far more mundane explanation is that Piri Reis, running out of usable animal skin at the bottom of his parchment, bent the coastline of Patagonia and Argentina sharply sideways just to fit it onto the page, and that distorted curve is what later got mistaken for a frozen continent. It's not aliens or lost civilizations. It's a sailor running out of space on a piece of leather 500 years ago. But here's the thing worth sitting with for a second. Even the boring explanation is still remarkable. This is a map, drawn without satellites, without GPS, built from 20 different secondhand sources by one man on a warship. And it still holds up well enough 5 centuries later that experts are debating a single bent coastline down to the meter. Sometimes the real story is less magical than the myth, but no less impressive. If you're the kind of person who enjoys watching a good mystery slowly get taken apart piece by piece, you're going to want to stick around for the next one, because this one involves a monk, a death sentence, and a book so large it needs 2 people just to lift it off a table. That story begins in Bohemia, in what's now the Czech Republic, sometime in the early 1200s inside a Benedictine monastery. Legend says a monk broke his sacred vows and was sentenced to the cruelest punishment his order could hand down, being sealed alive inside a wall. Desperate, he begged for one final chance. He would create, in a single night, a book containing all human knowledge, glorifying the monastery forever, and in exchange, his life would be spared. As midnight approached and the task proved impossible for any mortal hand, the monk is said to have prayed instead to the one figure he thought might actually help him finish in time: the devil himself. By dawn, the book was somehow complete, and the monk, in gratitude or perhaps in terror, added a full-page portrait of Satan to the manuscript as a kind of signature. That book still exists today. It's called the Codex Gigas, Latin for giant book, though most people simply call it the Devil's Bible. And the legend, dramatic as it isn't even close to the strangest part. The physical object itself is almost impossible to comprehend. It measures 3 feet long, weighs more than 160 pounds, and required the skins of over 160 animals just to produce its 310 pages of vellum. Modern scholars, running the numbers on how long it would take a single scribe to copy this much text by hand, even without accounting for the elaborate illustrations, estimate the job would have taken somewhere between 20 and 30 years of continuous, uninterrupted work. And that's the detail that should genuinely unsettle you. Handwriting experts who have studied the manuscript page by page report that the lettering shows no visible signs of fatigue, aging, illness, or change in style from the very first page to the very last. One person, working alone for decades, producing a document with perfectly uniform handwriting throughout, containing not just the entire Bible, but an encyclopedia, a full medical textbook, a history of Bohemia, and pages of magical charms and exorcism rites. No one knows for certain who this person really was. Tradition names him Herman the Recluse, but there's no solid proof beyond the legend itself. And to make things stranger, 10 pages are missing from the original manuscript, cut out at some point in its 800-year history, and nobody has ever recovered them or figured out what they contained. Some say monastery records, others whisper about forbidden rites. The truth is, we simply don't know. So no, it almost certainly wasn't written in one supernatural night. It was written across decades of extraordinary human discipline, but maybe that's actually the more haunting explanation. Not a deal with the devil, but a single person, alone in candlelight, giving their entire adult life to one book. Now let's cross the Atlantic to a farm field in rural Minnesota, autumn of 1898. A Swedish immigrant named Olof Oman was clearing land, wrestling a small poplar tree out of the ground, when he noticed something tangled in its roots. A slab of gray stone, roughly 200 pounds, covered edge to edge in strange, sharp-angled symbols. Oman, by his own account, had never seen anything like it, and initially wondered if it might be some kind of old almanac. What it actually appeared to be, once translated, was a runic inscription, written in the Old Norse language of Viking explorers, and it told a chilling little story. A group of 30 Norwegian and Swedish explorers, the inscription said, had traveled far inland from Vinland, the Viking name for the coast of North America, on a journey west. One day, part of the group went fishing. When they returned to camp, they found 10 of their companions lying dead, red with blood. The stone was dated to the year 1362. If genuine, that date would place Scandinavian explorers deep in the American interior, more than a full century before Columbus ever crossed the Atlantic, rewriting the entire timeline of European contact with North America. It's an electric idea. It's also, according to the overwhelming majority of linguists, archaeologists, and geologists who have examined the Kensington runestone over the past century, almost certainly a hoax. The runic characters used on the stone include letter forms and word constructions that 13th and 14th century Norse speakers would never have used, but that match patterns found in 19th century Scandinavian American dialect dictionaries, the exact kind of reference material available to Swedish immigrants living in Minnesota in the 1890s. The timing is suspicious too. The stone surfaced during a period of intense public fascination with Viking history across America, and its discoverer just happened to be a Scandinavian immigrant with a personal interest in that exact subject. And yet, more than 125 years later, the debate has never fully died. A small number of researchers still argue the weathering patterns on certain letters are inconsistent with a 19th century carving, and no one has ever definitively proven who carved the stone, when, or why, if it truly is a hoax. It remains sitting quietly in its own museum in Alexandria, Minnesota, to this day, still dividing experts, still drawing curious visitors who want to look at it and decide for themselves. Before we go further, if mysteries like this keep you hooked the way they're hooking me right now, do me a favor and hit that like button. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's a great time, because we've still got some of the strangest ones left to go. From a farm field in Minnesota, we're heading underwater now, to the floor of the Baltic Sea off the coast of Sweden, June of 2011. A small team of treasure hunters called Ocean X was doing what treasure hunters do, scanning the seabed with sonar, hoping to find a forgotten shipwreck. Instead, at a depth of around 90 meters, their equipment picked up something that made the whole crew stop and stare at the screen. A perfectly circular object, roughly 60 meters across, with straight, almost engineered-looking edges, sitting alone on the seafloor with what looked like a long track or trail leading away from it, as if something had slid across the bottom of the sea and come to rest. The divers who eventually descended to look at it in person described a strange sensation, equipment failing intermittently near the site, a feeling that something about the spot simply wasn't right. Naturally, the internet did what the internet does. Within weeks, it was being called a sunken UFO, a crashed alien vessel, a lost city, evidence of some ancient advanced technology hidden beneath the Baltic for millennia. Scientists took a more measured approach, and when a Stockholm University geologist named Volker Bruckert analyzed physical samples brought up from the site, the results were, frankly, underwhelming in the best possible way. Most of the rock samples were ordinary granite, gneiss, and sandstone, exactly the kind of material you'd expect from a seabed shaped by retreating glaciers during the last ice age. The most likely explanation, according to the geological consensus, is that the formation is a natural glacial deposit, a ridge or outcropping left behind as massive sheets of ice dragged rock and sediment across the Baltic Basin thousands of years ago, and simply happens to have an unusually circular, almost geometric shape from certain sonar angles. It's not aliens, it's very probably just a very strange-looking pile of very old rocks. But notice the pattern forming here. Time and time again, the boring answer turns out to be the correct one, and yet the boring answer never quite manages to kill the story. The Baltic Sea anomaly still gets discussed today, still shows up in documentaries, still gets treated as an open case in certain corners of the internet, even though the geology has been fairly thoroughly explained. Why? Maybe because there's something deeply satisfying about a mystery that resists a tidy ending, even after the tidy ending has technically already arrived. Let's go somewhere warmer. Florida, 1923, where a small, sickly Latvian immigrant named Edward Leedskalnin began quietly buying land and moving stone. Leedskalnin stood barely 5 feet tall and weighed around 100 pounds, and according to the story, he told anyone who would listen, he had been left standing at the altar back in Latvia by his 16-year-old fiancée, one day before their wedding. Heartbroken, he crossed the ocean alone, and over the following 28 years, working almost entirely by himself, at night, in secret, he quarried, carved, moved, and assembled more than 1,000 tons of oolite limestone into an elaborate structure he called Rock Gate, which the world now knows as Coral Castle. Some of the individual stone blocks he handled weighed over 30 tons apiece, roughly the weight of a loaded school bus, and he did it without a single crew member, without modern machinery, using little more than hand tools, ropes, pulleys, and a few improvised tripods made from telephone poles. Visitors who came to see him work, and there were many, since he charged a small fee for tours, reported that he refused to let anyone watch him actually move the stones. If someone approached while he was working, he would simply stop and wait until they left. He hinted, cryptically, that he understood forgotten secrets used by the builders of the Egyptian pyramids, and that he had unlocked some principle of magnetism and leverage that ordinary engineers didn't grasp. The most famous piece in the entire castle is a 9-ton coral gate, so perfectly balanced on its axis that, for decades, a small child could push it open with a single finger, until the internal bearing finally wore out in the 1980s. When engineers were eventually called in to repair it, removing it required 6 grown men and a 50-ton crane, and only then did they discover Leedskalnin's actual method. He had drilled a precise channel through the center of the stone and mounted it on a repurposed truck axle bearing a clever, practical piece of engineering, not magic. Most historians today believe Leedskalnin achieved his life's work through nothing more exotic than patience, an intuitive understanding of leverage and counterweights, and roughly 3 hours of dedicated labor every single day for nearly 3 decades. And yet the precise details of exactly how one small, unwell man single-handedly moved and set individual 30-ton blocks with such precision have never been fully reconstructed or successfully repeated by anyone else. He took the finer points of his method to his grave in 1951, Sometimes the most impressive achievements in history aren't the ones that require an impossible explanation. They're the ones built entirely from an ordinary, unglamorous, decades-long refusal to give up. Speaking of refusing to give up, nowhere on Earth captures pure, stubborn obsession quite like a small patch of forest on Oak Island off the coast of Nova Scotia, Canada. The story allegedly begins in 1795, when a teenage boy exploring the island noticed a slight depression in the ground beneath an old oak tree, with what looked like tackle block marks on a branch above it, as if something heavy had once been lowered down using ropes and pulleys. He and two friends started digging. 10 feet down, they hit a layer of flagstones. Deeper still, they found layers of logs, spaced roughly every 10 feet, along with mysterious deposits of charcoal, putty, and what was later identified as coconut fiber, a material that has no business naturally occurring anywhere near Nova Scotia. Word spread. Money poured in. Organized excavation companies formed across the following 2 centuries, digging deeper and deeper into what became known as the Money Pit, hunting for what many believed was an enormous buried treasure. Theories ranging from pirate gold hidden by Captain Kidd, to the lost personal fortune of Marie Antoinette, to Shakespearean manuscripts, to, in the wilder corners of the theory space, the Ark of the Covenant or the Holy Grail itself, supposedly hidden there by the Knights Templar. What makes Oak Island genuinely strange, beyond the treasure legends, is the engineering. Multiple excavations over the decades were repeatedly, catastrophically flooded by seawater flowing in through what appears to be a deliberately constructed drainage system connecting the pit to the nearby cove, a feat of hydraulic engineering that, if it truly was built deliberately centuries ago as a booby trap, would have required serious planning and manpower. Several search teams have died attempting to solve the mystery over the years, including a father, his adult son, and 2 other men who were overcome by toxic gas in a shaft in 1965, a tragedy so consistent with the island's older folklore that locals had long claimed a curse would take 7 lives before the treasure was ever found. To this day, despite well over 200 years of digging, extensive modern excavation efforts, and even a long-running television series dedicated entirely to the search, no definitive treasure has ever been recovered, and no one has conclusively proven who built the original pit, why, or whether the entire Money Pit story even started from a real discovery at all, rather than a heavily exaggerated local legend that simply grew with each retelling. It remains one of the most expensive unsolved mysteries in North America, an ongoing sinkhole, quite literally, for both money and hope. If you're enjoying this journey through history's stubborn unsolved cases, go ahead and share this video with someone who'd get just as hooked as you are right now, because the next stop takes us all the way out into deep space. August 15th, 1977, Ohio State University. An astronomer named Jerry Amon was reviewing a stack of computer printouts from Big Ear, a massive radio telescope scanning the skies for any unusual signal that might suggest intelligent life elsewhere in the universe. Most nights produce nothing but background static, faint noise, cosmic background hiss. But on this particular printout, Amon's eyes landed on a sequence of characters representing signal strength that made him stop cold. The numbers climbed steadily, peaked at a value so strong it briefly exceeded the telescope's normal measurement scale, and then faded back down, all within a window of just 72 seconds, roughly the amount of time the telescope's rotation would have kept a fixed point in the sky within its field of view. Stunned, Amon circled the sequence in red pen and scrawled a single word in the margin: wow. The signal, forever after, known as the WOW. Signal appeared to originate from the direction of the constellation Sagittarius, at a very specific radio frequency, long theorized by scientists to be a likely channel for interstellar communication, since it corresponds to the natural emission frequency of hydrogen, the most abundant element in the universe, something any advanced civilization studying physics would likely stumble upon. Astronomers pointed telescopes back at that exact patch of sky again and again in the following years, decades even, hoping to catch a second occurrence. Nothing. Not once, not ever, has anything resembling that signal been detected again from that location. Proposed explanations over the decades have ranged from a passing comet releasing a burst of hydrogen gas to a military or classified satellite transmission accidentally reflecting off something in the atmosphere, to simple, undetected equipment interference. None of these explanations have ever been proven conclusively, and none have fully satisfied the scientific community. So the honest, unglamorous truth is this: nearly 50 years later, we still do not know what produced the WOW signal. It might have been a natural astrophysical fluke. It might have been terrestrial interference nobody ever traced. Or, and this is the possibility that keeps this 72-second printout famous half a century later, it might have been exactly what it looked like on the page that night in 1977. A brief, one-time transmission from somewhere else, received by us at precisely the right moment and never repeated again. Let's bring this journey back down to Earth and back in time to the summer of 1587. on a small island off the coast of what is now North Carolina. A group of over 100 English settlers, men, women, and children, led by a man named John White, established a colony on Roanoke Island, hoping to build a permanent English foothold in the New World. Resources ran low almost immediately. Relations with the local Algonquian people grew tense. Facing a difficult winter and dwindling supplies, White made the difficult decision to sail back to England for reinforcements, promising his colonists, which included his own infant granddaughter, Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the Americas, that he would return as quickly as possible. War broke out between England and Spain. White was delayed for 3 long years before he could finally secure passage back across the Atlantic. When he finally returned to Roanoke in August of 1590, expecting to embrace his family and the community he had left behind, he found nothing. No people, no bodies, no signs of a struggle, a battle, or a hasty, panicked evacuation. The colony's buildings had been carefully, deliberately dismantled, as though the residents had planned an orderly departure rather than fled in terror. The only clues left behind were 2 carved messages. The letters CRO carved into a tree and the full word Croatoan carved into a wooden post at the entrance to the settlement. White had actually established a prearranged signal with his colonists before he left. If they were forced to relocate, they would carve their destination, and if they left under distress or attack, they would also carve a cross symbol nearby. No cross was found. The most widely accepted theory today is that the colonists, running out of food and unable to wait any longer for White's return, relocated to live among the friendly Croatoan people on a nearby island, gradually integrating into their community, a theory partly supported by later reports of indigenous groups in the region with gray eyes and fair-colored hair passed down through intermarriage. But storms, wartime delays, and simple bad luck meant White himself never got the chance to follow that trail and confirm it. And no conclusive physical evidence, no graves, no definitive artifacts, has ever settled the question with total certainty. More than 4 centuries later, the fate of the Roanoke colonists remains one of the oldest unsolved disappearances in American history, a quiet, human mystery hiding behind 2 carved words on a wooden post. So what do you actually do with a list like this? 9 different mysteries spread across 5 continents and roughly 1,000 years of human history. And if you look closely at almost every single one of them, the pattern repeats itself with almost eerie consistency. Something strange gets discovered. The wildest, most thrilling explanation spreads first, because it's the one that captures imaginations and headlines. Then, slowly, carefully, sometimes over decades, actual researchers show up with actual evidence, and more often than not, the truth turns out to be a little less magical than the myth. A distorted coastline on an old map, a retreating glacier dragging rocks into a strange shape. A lonely, heartbroken man with more patience than anyone around him. And yet, here's the part that I think actually matters more than which theory turns out to be correct. Even after the mundane explanation arrives, even after geologists and historians and linguists have done their careful and glamorous work, these stories never actually stop being told. We keep coming back to them, generation after generation, not necessarily because we need them to be literally true, but because they remind us of something we don't like to admit very often, that the past is far larger, stranger, and less thoroughly mapped than we'd like to pretend. We've walked on the ocean floor with sonar, mapped riverbeds from orbit, and cracked open ancient scrolls with lasers, and we still can't say with total certainty what exploded over Siberia in 1908, or what became of 100 missing colonists on a small island off North Carolina, or what briefly touched a radio telescope in Ohio for exactly 72 seconds and was never heard from again. Maybe that unfinished feeling is exactly the point. Maybe the reason these stories survive isn't despite the fact that we can't fully solve them, but because of it. If you made it all the way to the end of this one, that probably means you're exactly the kind of person who needs to hit subscribe right now, because there are a lot more of these strange, unfinished stories still waiting to be told, and I genuinely love to have you here for the next one.